In a few moments, we're going to talk to our panel about the Obama administration's plans for regulating the financial institutions. But first, to set the scene, Elizabeth Warren teaches commercial law at Harvard and currently chairs the Congressional Oversight Panel to oversee implementation of the bailout of last year. Last week, she sat down with the American News Project and McClatchy newspapers to talk about Obama and the issues of oversight itself. Take a look.
The central difference between the Financial Product Safety Commission and our current regulatory structure is twofold. The first is that the new agency will regulate by product rather than by issuer. It is an accident of history that consumer financial products are regulated based on who issues them rather than on what they are. If a mortgage is issued by a federally chartered bank, there's one set of rules. If it's a federally chartered thrift, there's a second set of rules. If it's a state bank, it's a different set of rules. If it's a state thrift, it's a different set of rules. If it's a state industrial organization, it's yet a different set of rules. The idea behind this agency is to say, this is what a home mortgage looks like. If anyone wants to issue it, here's the set of safety rules. You know, it's almost as if we had said, if aspirin is produced by a national manufacturer, he'll be the set of safety rules, and if it's produced by a state manufacturer, he'll be, the set of, and if it's produced by a foreign manufacturer, then we'll have, and if it's produced by a guy in his bathtub with a bunch of chemicals, then, here'll be the rules. So what this does is it takes the basic notion that from the consumer's point of view, what matters is the product, and so the product will face the same basic regulations regardless of what kind of institution sells it to the consumer. And that's a sea change. That's a huge shift. It will pull some regulatory authority from other places, but by and large, it will be new authority that simply replaces the old approaches. That's really a big difference.
President Obama rolled out the administration's much-anticipated agenda for financial regulatory reform last week in a remarkable mixture of free market confidence and Keynesian caution. Take a look.
There's always been a tension between those who place their faith in the invisible hand of the marketplace and those who place more trust in the guiding hand of the government. And that tension isn't a bad thing, for we know that markets are not an unalloyed force for either good or for ill. In many ways, our financial system reflects us. In the aggregate of countless independent decisions, we see the potential for creativity and the potential for abuse. We see the capacity for innovations that make our economy stronger and for innovations that exploit our economy's weaknesses. We are called upon to put in place those reforms that allow our best qualities to flourish, while keeping those worst traits in check.
All right, so you got that? As always, the devil is in the details, and the details truly make heads spin. Today we're going to break it down. Will anything the administration has announced actually stop or slow the bleeding in our banking system and in our economy? Conservatives and big business are pushing back against the proposed new Consumer Financial Protection Agency. Is it actually the regulatory threat they fear it might be? And what about that power to the Fed that some in Washington are so concerned about? We will hear. Joining us in studio, Les Leopold. He's the author of The Looting of America, How Wall Street's Game of Fantasy Finance Destroyed Our Jobs, Pensions and Prosperity. He's also a contributor to the Huffington Post. Nomi Prins is back, former Wall Street broker and senior fellow at Demos, the author of It Takes a Pillage, Behind the Bailouts, Bonuses, and Backroom Deals from Washington to Wall Street. A lot of alliteration going on here today. And from Kansas City, Missouri, William Black, professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and a former senior bank regulator during the savings and loan crisis. He's also the author of The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. Well, I don't know, let's start with you, Nomi. The good, the bad, the ugly. You said there was good and there was bad. Start with the good.
Well, the good is the Consumer Financial Protection Agency, if it can be created in such a way that it has power, It is listened to, it can enforce, and all the Wall Street forces don't absolutely kill it before it sees the light of day, which is what they have geared up to do between banks, their lobbyists, the Chamber of Commerce, everyone who's got a stake involved. It would be a good thing because it would be an agency that's in Washington that can be hopefully on par with other regulatory bodies like the SEC. But that is only if it's given the power.
All right, so that's one of the goods. William, to you, is there a good in all of this that you see?
But I would add that it would need the leadership. If it were on the par with the SEC, after all, it would be a failure.
All right, coming back to you, Les. It's the good, the bad, the ugly. We're still on the good. Is there a good that we haven't mentioned so far?
Well, the idea of major reforms at least is in the public domain. We can talk about it. We can actually bring up ideas that a few years ago we would have been laughed out of even this studio. So that's the good part.
Yeah, go ahead. I hear a butt coming.
Oh, yeah, there's some major buts. I don't think it addresses the two major things that have to be addressed. This crisis was caused by an incredibly bad distribution of wealth that started in the mid-'70s. Money gushed up to the top fraction of 1%. That created the demand for all these fantasy finance instruments. If we don't do something about the redistribution of income, this problem will recreate itself.
Because this wasn't just a function of the weather or barometric bars across the country, not exactly.
No, and also the sector itself, the financial sector, got so bloated that the other criteria we should use is, are we shrinking it down? And the things that could have been done to shrink it down were not done, like stronger wage caps, discourage people from going into Wall Street. That would be a good thing. The DeFazio tax, a very small tax on all financial transactions, that would move money from the financial sector into the real economy. That's the stuff that we need to be pushing for, or it just we will not change it.
Nomi, back to you. Timothy Geithner and Lawrence Summers wrote on the 15th of June in the Washington Post in an op-ed, "This week at the President's direction, after months of consultation, the administration will put forward a plan to modernize financial regulation and supervision. The goal is to create a more stable regulatory regime that is flexible and effective and able to secure the benefits of financial innovation while guarding against its own excess." What of this has been accomplished?
None of it's been accomplished. But I mean,
what is put in place from this proposal?
There's two elements put in place in terms of regulations in the proposal, and I just want to echo what William said. Is yes, if the Consumer Financial Protection Agency is like the SEC, it will fail. The SEC has not been ahead of the curve or tried to pretend to be with respect to all the securities and leverage that was taken by Wall Street. In fact, the SEC set Wall Street up by listening to Wall Street to have the kind of leverage that it had. But what this plan is attempting to do is merge two regulatory bodies in Washington, the Office of Thrift Supervision and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. Thrift Supervision was the one that was supposed to be in charge of S&Ls. Geithner and Sumners are pointing to the fact that because AIG, which wasn't a S&L, failed so badly and cost $220 billion of our bailout money, this is one of the things that should be deleted. However, the problem is AIG should never have been classified as an S&L. It's classifications in legislation that are not even addressed by any of these plans.
William, to you, you know a little bit about the Office of Thrift Supervision. You were there during the S&L crisis. Did you feel a little pang when you heard it was getting the axe?
No, we've been expecting it for a long time. The irony is that it's the second killing by the same senior regulator, Darryl Doko, killed the first savings and loan regulator when he caved in to the pressure of the Keating Five and Speaker Wright. As a result of our congressional testimony, he was demoted about 7 levels. And over 20 years, he rose back through the ranks and became the senior regulator for all of the worst savings and loans in the subprime crisis, and finally resigned in disgrace when it was discovered that he had encouraged an institution to backdate its financial statements to make it appear healthier. That was IndyMac. So we knew that OTS was doomed.
So what do you think of the proposal to consolidate more power in the FDIC in light of the axing of OTS?
Well, if it were really going to give the FDIC more power, that would be a relatively good thing. The FDIC, it's the old in the Valley of the Blind, the one-eyed man or woman is king or queen. They've been by far the best of the regulatory agencies. Because they have the insurance function, they institutionally are more conservative. The worst conceivable place to put it, unfortunately, it being more regulatory authority, is in the Fed, and that's really what the Obama administration is stressing, putting more powers in the Fed.
Well, but for a very different type of critique, here's a bit of what was happening on the Senate floor when Tim Geithner testified presenting this new plan. You're going to hear Senator David Vitter from Louisiana and Bob Corker from Tennessee. Take a listen.
The Fed needs approval from Treasury. I think that is a big change in terms of the independence of the Fed. I think that's really crossing a line and a sort of fundamental change in terms of the nature of the Fed. And I just point that out as a big concern, because all of a sudden the Fed is acting more like a department of the government than an independent bank. It's asking Treasury for permission.
Would it make sense for the President to, in writing, tell all of us that no one involved in creating this at the White House or Cabinet will be appointed as Fed Secretary or Fed Chairman?
No, I don't think that would be appropriate. No, nor do I think it would be necessary.
All right, well, you have both the quotes there. One, they're complaining about how much power, and B, they're clearly concerned that Geithner's going to be getting it. Is he? Is that the problem?
Geithner, first of all, was the Fed as much as Ben Bernanke is the Fed. The $7.5 trillion worth of subsidies and cheap loans and toxic collateral that has gone into the Federal Reserve was done in the last 8 or 9 months under Bernanke and under Tim Geithner when he was the head of the New York Fed. In fact, more of a proportion, 20% more of that $7.5 trillion has actually gone through the New York Fed. So whether Geithner wants another job or not later is besides the point. I also don't agree that the Treasury is trying to define the Fed. The relationship is so tight and the Fed has been so strong and so secretive that, echoing what William was saying and what a lot of people are very concerned about, and I think is ridiculous, giving the Fed any more authority to do absolutely anything is the wrong way to go in anything that considers itself to be an overhaul of the financial system. The Fed blessed mergers. The Fed gave out money. The Fed is created in a conflict of interest whereby it's supposed to supervise a sector that it also is allowed to print money to save when that sector fails based on its own poor judgment. That is not an institution that deserves more supervision. It's an institution that deserves to be split apart.
Now, coming to you on this, Les, I mean, one of the arguments that Timothy Geithner made very strongly in the hearings was that he didn't have enough power. He said, we didn't have the tools we need. We didn't have the resources we need. Is that true? Specifically, did the Fed not have enough power?
Well, from where I sit, I think that whole way of framing the debate misses the point. The most telling statistic I've run across lately is that the top 300,000 taxpayers have as much income as the bottom 150 million Americans. 300,000 equals 150 million. I don't see anything in this proposal at any level that changes that. And if we don't demand a change of that, we are going to perpetuate an ongoing boom, bust, bubble crisis on Wall Street, because all that money that is drifted up to the top has to be invested someplace.
But there aren't even any basic restrictions on on executive compensation here.
As far as I can tell, there's no restrictions even on the worst derivatives. I mean, banks already keep, as Mr. Black pointed out, already keep more than 5% of their synthetic products that they create. And by exempting all kinds of special created derivatives, you're creating a huge incentive for more financial engineering. And the last thing America needs is more financial engineering.
William Black, to you, I mean, you've been inside these same halls of power. How do you think, based on your experience, this plan got drawn up? Who is in the ear of the president on it, and what do they seek to gain? Because he certainly has plenty of constituents who are very clear about what they were hoping for, and it mostly wasn't this.
Well, the decision-making is overwhelmingly by Summers, and when you talk about Summers, you can't avoid talking about Rubin, sort of the intellectual godfather, who's still a major source of these ideas, and Geithner. And what these people share in common is a very substantial distrust of regulation and a religious belief at the level of dogma in terms of markets. So that they actually, in this plan, want to, desire to recreate a secondary market in the toxic waste. Now, that secondary market cost us roughly $1 trillion. It got us essentially nothing in the way of benefits. That's utter insanity, and that's the kind of decision-making we have.
I mean, that takes us back to the Fed again. I mean, you point out in your article, your most recent article on all this, Nomi, it was the Citigroup that grabbed the biggest part of the bailout money. Yeah. Citigroup, formerly headed by Robert Rubin, former Treasury Secretary. Fed should have been regulating. A
man who made $126 million in the years that he was at Citigroup as an executive senior and making decisions, and who was in Washington when right before the legislation was passed to allow Citigroup to exist. When Glass-Steagall was repealed through the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act in 1999, it was a few months after Rubin had handed over the mantle to Sumner's, but he also was deeply benefiting from it. Citigroup benefited from it. Citigroup has today gotten $388 billion worth of government bailout subsidies and guarantees that we know of. That does not include the trillions of dollars of cheap collateral and toxic collateral that the Fed has allowed banks like Citigroup to post in return for cheap loans at 0.5% or less than 1% interest indefinitely, basically, because they are all rolling loans. So it's all dogma, but it's real money behind it, and it's a complete lack of understanding that we should actually be dissecting the banking industry rather than subsidizing the growth of these mega institutions out of the types of deregulation that Rubin and Summers and Geithner and that ilk are in favor of.
William, back to you. What has happened to those who argued that you shouldn't have institutions that are too big to fail? They should be too big to exist. What happened to that part of this picture?
Well, that's the really most interesting thing, I think, about the entire set of the white papers that they put out with this proposal, because buried in there is a statement that says that these institutions that are too big to fail pose a systemic risk of bringing down the entire global economy. Well, that's true, but these are the same institutions that the administration has been trying to rebrand as systemically important organizations, as opposed to banks posing systemic risk. What we obviously need to do is first stop them from growing, and we're doing the opposite. Whenever a big institution fails, we have a too big to fail place, acquire it with federal aid. And then we need to shrink them, because if they're too big to fail, they're too big to regulate, and they're too big to manage.
Partly too big to regulate because of their political influence, Les?
Well, of course. I mean, the top 300,000 people are going to protect the top 300,000 people. That's the way it's been running for the last 30 years. But I think the problem that Mr. Black is pointing out of what to do about too big to fail is a huge problem. And the dialogue that we're having in this country right now about that is pathetic. I mean, we need to have some ideas on the table about how to bust them up. I mean, I'm all ears about how to shrink them down, how to break them up, how to reduce the size of the sector. But that dialogue is not happening, at least openly.
Well, that goes to your $13 trillion. What could we have done with it differently?
Well, we could have paid for everyone's mortgage in the country and for health care and for everybody's student loan, which is one thing we could have done differently with the money. We also could have not subsidized banks that are failing. We could have cut them to size. We could have said, you know what,
But was there nothing in the argument, in the Clinton argument, that in fact this is going to cause massive dislocation?
There were two senators who basically said this was going to cost a lot of money back in 1999, and that was Byron Dorgan, who has written a book about the topic now and said that decision would cost billions of dollars. He might have thought trillions, but even he could not conceive a decade later it would be so much money. And Senator Wellstone, who died. And basically, there has been no pushback. There's no conversation in Congress saying, things are too big to fail. Gee, what can we do? How about we break them up? How about we make them smaller? How about we make these things that are too complex to regulate something that we can actually manage, rather than talking about what we need to do on the top to regulate this mess that we have?
Were there lessons learned from the S&L crisis, William, that would be applicable today?
Yes, and they're central to the discussion you just had, and the fact that they're not better known is a testament to what my colleagues have been saying and how badly framed the debate is. Out of the savings and loan crisis came an understanding that this kind of forbearance with failed institutions was disastrous, that they have the worst possible incentives and the losses will greatly multiply if you leave insolvent banks open, in particular, of course, under their existing management. And so the prompt corrective action law mandates, specifically designed to remove discretion, mandates that seriously insolvent banks must be put into conservatorship or receivership. And that law is being deliberately ignored and evaded through massive accounting fraud. And that, unfortunately, Congress is highly complicit in, and the administration didn't raise a finger to try to stop.
Well, that goes back to, do we have the tools we need? Just to remind you, this is what Tim Geithner had to say about needing more regulatory powers.
We came into this crisis without an adequate set of tools to confront and deal with the potential failures of large, complex financial institutions. That left the government with extremely limited choices when faced with the failure of the largest insurance company in the world and some of the world's largest investment banks. And that is why, in addition to addressing the root causes of this crisis, putting in place a better framework for crisis prevention in the future, we have to act to give the government better tools to manage future crises.
Nomi?
We had 5 regulatory bodies in Washington in charge of looking at different aspects of the financial industry. We had a Congress that could have at any time said, you know what, let's take a look at what's going on over there and see if it's okay. We did not lack the tools. They lacked the will to actually do their jobs. And so adding regulatory power to the ones that did their job the least well, which is the Fed, or even to create new agencies, the consumer one aside, because that hopefully can be a little bit different, we will see, is really perpetuating the same situation that got us into this mess and got the banks out with $13 trillion worth of subsidization to go and continue to be as big and as dangerous and as reckless and as expensive as they got to be.
All right, you get the last word. I don't think we can top that. Thank you, Nomi Prins, William Black, and Les Leopold. All of you, we'll continue this conversation for sure. There's more right here at GRITtv.org coming up. Stay tuned.